Greetings, New Life family. This is Pastor Jared. I am doing a different series now on our midweek videos. I have done series on hymns, on various other topics such as the Psalms, and on books to read. This time, though, for the next few weeks, I know people are thinking about a particular subject right now, and that subject being politics. However, I am not going to tell you exactly who you should vote for on every single line of your ballot. But I did think something that would be useful for us is, how do we think about politics as Christians? How do we navigate that and use wisdom? Because if you look in the Bible, it's not going to tell you exactly who to vote for. That's not going to say you need to vote this party line ballot. But it does give you some direction of how you should think about government. And sometimes our thinking may be more influenced by popular notions we got in school, or even from just kind of our American culture, and they may not be rooted in the Bible. And we may have some conflicting ideas, even on questions such as, can Christians serve in government? Should we be involved in government at all? What's the relationship between the church and the state? What is our duty to our government? Should we obey, or we just to obey the Lord alone and just ignore the government? And where did government come from? Is it artificial? Is it something that God never intended? Well, we actually have in our Confession of Faith an entire chapter that is dedicated to what it calls the civil magistrate, which means the governing authority, whoever the government is and whoever's serving in it. And it talks about certain principles that are there that are derived from Scripture. And what I thought I would do is read for us different sections from this chapter and show you the actual Scripture that it's in, and then actually take our principles from Scripture. The very first line from chapter 23 of the Civil Magistrate in the Westminster Confession says, "God, the supreme Lord and King of all the world, hath ordained civil magistrates to be under him, over the people, for his own glory and the public good, and to this end hath armed them with the power of the sword, for the defense and the encouragement of them that are good, and for the punishment of evildoers." Now, this isn't something that the ones who wrote the Westminster Confession just came up on their own and thought this was wise. The scripture text that it's quoting there is actually Romans chapter 13, which says this. This is Paul writing in chapter 13 of Romans to his listeners. "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant, for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger, who carries out God's wrath on the evildoer." What's the principle that we're looking at there? Well, first, notice it says there's no authority except from God, and God has instituted then governing authorities. The institution of government is ordained by God, just as the institution of the church is ordained by God. We get more detail of that when it says, this is how you choose an elder, this is how you choose a deacon. These are officers in the institution of the church. This is how the church does discipline and instruction and the Lord's Supper and all these things that institution does. Well, also the institution of government is ordained by God, which means we can't just ignore it, which means that we also need to obey it. It says that we should submit to those that are in authority. Whoever resists the authorities resists what God appointed. This is talking about in general principles. If you resist having any kind of a government over you, if you resist the government that's over you just because you don't like government, you resist what God has ordained. This is why you should not just within the borders of a country, form some sort of a militia group and rebel against the government and say, we don't accept your law anymore. Well, if that's the law of the land, if that's the governing authority of that land, that is the rightly appointed authority. Now it says that we aren't to resist that government. Now this is also talking in principles, which means that if their laws are lawful, we shouldn't resist it. Now, if the laws are not lawful, of course we are to resist that. How does a law not be lawful? Well, all law is based on either the direct law of God or wisdom for how it is that we govern our lives. And so if a law contradicts God's law, it is not something that we are to submit to. For instance, when Peter is told that he is not to preach Jesus anymore, he says, should we obey man or God? We're going to obey God. This is often thought of as obeying in the Lord, right? Sometimes within wives and husbands, they're told to submit in the Lord. In other words, there's a leading that you submit to, but once it crosses the line of morality, once it crosses the line of God's moral law, if your husband tells you or your parent tells you to do something that is against God's law, you are not to obey that. But if they're telling you to do wise things, prudent things, even things that you don't like, but you need to do, you do those things. So unfortunately, although sometimes I laugh at the response whenever people talk about taxation, that taxation is theft, it's actually not. It's something that the government does and is given authority to do. So even though we don't like paying taxes, we have to pay our taxes. Even though we don't like going 30 miles an hour on that road because you can go 45 and you're safe, still you obey the governing authorities because they haven't told you to do something that contradicts God's law. Now, if the governing authority says you cannot worship God, the governing authority says you cannot be baptized, if the governing authority says you cannot proclaim Christ, then we obey God rather than man. But the first principle that we can just sit on for a little bit and meditate on is Romans 13, verses 1 to 4, which tells us God instituted government, and he did it for a reason. Notice it says that God gave them the sword, that is the authority to execute sentences for doing what is wrong, gave them the sword that they may promote what is good and they might put down what is wrong. In fact, here's an interesting thing, for he is the servant of God. First of all, that's interesting. In the old King James language, that is minister. He's a minister of God. Minister just means servant. He's a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Remember how God says, vengeance belongs to me? That tells us we're not to be a vigilante. As much as we may like superhero movies, we're not to go out there and punish crime on our own. We are to have governing authorities that do that. Now, within this fallen world, these principles often are not lived up to by governments, and you call them to live up to those. Sometimes there's people who aren't covered by the laws that you call the government to cover. Sometimes there are things that are legal that aren't right, and so we don't do those things, and we encourage others not to do those things. Sometimes there are things that are forbidden that are good, and the good thing, especially if it's commanded of us, we go ahead and we still do. So there are times to disobey it, but we need to remember, even in those times, God instituted government for our good, for his purposes, and thus for his glory. So when we interact with government officials, realize they're a minister. Would you, hopefully you wouldn't just interact with a pastor or an elder in a disrespectful way because you don't like their position. Neither should we do that with a police officer, a mayor, a politician. Any of those roles that people may hold, if they're in elected office, if they're in governing authority, we need to respect it because God instituted the government to be over us. That's our first principle that we have to learn. God instituted government. It's for our good to put down evil and regulate, and we are to submit to it and honor it insofar as it doesn't contradict God's law. we'll come back later for more principles, but I think that's enough to focus on for now. To look into that more, read through Romans chapter 13, read through the first section of chapter 23 of the Westminster Confession, and read through 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 and 14 if you want to reflect on this principle a little bit more. But that's enough for now, and so I hope that you are well, and this finds you well. Thank you.